Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of the 2025 Lunch and Learn series. I'm going to share some slides in a second, but I just want to introduce the particulars here on the panel. I'm Matt Doobie, the chair of the main GIS user group. We are joined by Steve Harmon, who is our education coordinator. We're joined by Ashley Gamache, and we are also joined by Rosemary Mosher, who's our vice chair and also will be our presenter this afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides briefly, just as an orientation here. So we're going to be talking about GIS for historical research today. I'll let Rosemary do more about that when we get there. On April, that's today. We are currently scheduling the date for our next Lunch and Learn topic, which will be about QGIS for municipal applications. And we are always interested in receiving suggestions from folks about presentations they might be willing to give or things they'd like to see talked about in the community. So please, if you have any ideas, please reach out to the email that you see at the bottom of the screen. Or if you want to get involved in other ways with the organization, please reach out to the email on the screen. Also, you can see our website there at the bottom left. On May 14th, we're hosting a Mappy Hour in conjunction with the Maine Municipal Association's annual conference. That'll start at 4 p.m. at the Randall Student Center at UMA. It will go until 6 p.m. We have a lightning talk proposal deadline upcoming on April 25th. We have a suggested registration date by April 30th to help us with food costs and whatnot, but we will estimate a few more people than that. So if you can help us to get a head count by that, that would be much appreciated. We look forward to being able to connect with people in that sort of setting in a pretty central location. I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors, our gold sustaining members, Blue Marble Geographics, CAI Technologies, EJP Smart Utility Professionals, Esri, NV5, Maine Technical Source, Sewell. Our silver sustaining members, the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, the Maine Department of Transportation, Maine Office of GIS, the Maine Public Utilities Commission, Tetra Tech, Viewshed, which Rosemary represents here today, the University of Maine's Raymond H. Folger Library, the Wheatland Geospatial Lab at the University of Maine, the University of Southern Maine GIS unit. The Maine Geo Library is a bronze sustaining member, CGIS Solutions, Dirigo Spatial Systems, the Greater Portland Council of Governments, GEI Consultants, Portland Water District, Stantec, St. George Consulting Group, Summit Natural Gas, and Wright Pierce. So as always, we thank our sponsors and hope to have continuing relationships with them and more in the future. Today, we're going to have an exciting talk by Rosemary Mosher, our vice chair. She's a GIS analyst at Viewshed, and she's going to be talking to us about using GIS in historical research. And I know that she's had a wealth of experience with this over her career. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Rosemary if she has anything else she'd like to throw out about herself as an introduction.
I think you pretty much covered it. I think the one thing I will say is that I've been doing GIS for a long time. I think it's around 25 years now. But I started my career in GIS because of my interest in maps and because of my interest in historical maps. I knew that probably would not get me a job with a lot of pay, but I knew that doing traditional GIS might, so, or at least more. So I went that route. But historical GIS and historical research have always been my real passion, and hope to share some of that with you today, and hope to also maybe inspire some of you to find ways to incorporate GIS into whatever your passion might be. So I'm going to start off here with trying to get my screen. There we go. So this was sort of the first thing that a lot of us do when we start thinking about historical GIS. This is a 1871 Historical Atlas by F.W. De Beers. They created them for most of the state. There are other atlases as well. This one I happen to like. And this was Cumberland County. This is what it looks like when you zoom in and do a high resolution scan. So a lot of detail here, as you can see. If you look, you can see that, there are graveyards and there are schools and obviously all the various people. So that actually is a really good way to begin to think about using this technology to actually bring in some historical data into GIS. You'll also notice that there are a lot of insets in these maps, and those insets provide a really good. I'm trying to figure out how to make this advance. Why will this not advance? There we go.
You should have a top arrow there. And I also want to mention, if people have questions, we have a Q&A feature. Please pop your questions in there. I forgot to mention that at the beginning.
So this is one of the insets. This is Gambo Falls, and you can see on the left there's lots of insets, all different towns. They basically used to do insets for almost every town. I like this one in particular, and I bring this one up because one of the things I'm working on right now, I work a lot with LiDAR, and Wyndham has some nice high resolution LiDAR. So I'm hoping to do some LiDAR and see what I can find in this area, see what kind of historical remnants there might be on the ground. So it's something that I'm working on, but I didn't have done quite in time to show today. And then the other thing I want to bring into this before I go too much further is I wanted to talk about, I'm going wrong way, the data that you're using. So, if you attended the last talk, Mike talked a lot about, the focus of it was data quality. And I think a lot about that. I've thought a lot about it more since his talk, but every source I think about and what the data quality is. And so far with the atlases, there's the obvious issues with any kind of map and the types of things that happen, but there's not a lot of bias in these that I can see, that I've been able to find so far. So they're a pretty good source of where things were, who was where and when. So that can be a pretty decent source for what we're doing. I'm sure there's some things that I'm not aware of, but some that I've seen. So the first thing I've done is I have discovered that generally when I'm doing georeferencing of this type, I try to make it a black and white image. It makes it a little bit easier for me to see, and I can make it semi-transparent and I can see what I'm doing. And I zoom in, and in this case, I actually created a database where I've put in what type of point it is, if there's a name on it, and any other notes and source information. Every time I created a database for GIS for historical records, I almost always put a map source. And as I've gone further, I get more and more complicated or more and more detailed with that. So I might put what the map source is, but I also where I found it, when I found it, all of the information you might put for any kind of paper that you might write, because ultimately a lot of times these end up being papers that I've written. And they're again really detailed for the Gambo Falls area. Once you've done that, you can then, because it's a database, you can start filtering and sorting and doing all kinds of things. So in this case, I've just pulled out the cemeteries and the schools. I've worked a lot with Wyndham Historical Society. They were really interested in this because there were a couple of cemeteries that they haven't been able to find, that they knew existed, but they weren't sure where they were. The locations on these are, they're iffy at best, but they are a good starting point for where to look for something on the ground. So they can be really useful for that sort of thing. You can also do things where I have an application set up so somebody can go in and search for their name or their family name and see where people in their family lived. And then you can do things like putting this data on top of, this is an 1804 subdivision plan for the town of Wyndham. And that can give you an idea of which of the original town plots had the cemeteries, which had schools, that sort of thing. You can also get into range roads. I know Steve works for the town of Wyndham. We've talked a lot about that and range roads and that sort of thing. So it can be really useful for that. So the next piece that I sort of embarked upon was when I was working at the University of Southern Maine, and I did some work for Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, and I ran across this publication that was done in 1994. I was there about 10 years later, and it was done by Ed Hawes, who was I believe he was retired at the time, professor and historian, and he did I think it was 175 pages, and he basically did an inventory of all the toxic, historic, potentially toxic pollution sources in the city of Portland. When I first saw it, I remember thinking, "Oh, this is really cool. I could put this in GIS." So that's what I started to do. So just to show you how much of a geek I am, the source on a lot of this is Portland City Directories. So on the left is what they look like if you haven't seen one before. And on the right is what is in my living room in the corner, which is a stack of city directories that I use to put a vase with flowers on top because I'm such a geek and I can't throw them away. City directories are a wealth of information. So for this particular project, I went in and you can see that it lists by the type of business, all of the businesses, and I'm going to put all of the businesses in quotes because there was a paid advertising um, aspect to this. And I think as you go further into the city directories, you get into the 1900s and the middle of the 20th century, people were buying them for the information in them. And so they were probably a little more complete. But the early ones, as I will show you a little bit later, were not very complete. What they do is they give you information on the address and the type of business that it is. So there is an issue with all of this. For those who might have been around in 1988, I was doing GIS, or not GIS, but I was around back then. And in 1988, the state of Maine, there was a bond issue and we implemented 911. So what did that mean? Well, what that meant is a lot of roads changed names, and a lot of the roads that didn't change names changed numbering. And so for an example, I lived in Wyndham. In Wyndham, there were 3 cottage roads. There was Cottage Road, Cottage Ave, and Cottage Lane, I think it was. And I lived on one of them. I had number 141. And in the course of the next 3 years, I went from 141 to 15 to 150 something and then to 115. So I had 4 addresses in 4 years, which was a little bit confusing. So you can imagine when you're trying to map data from the 1800s, you can't use the current 911 data because it just doesn't work. So when I'm mapping something, and if it's a short street, I'm not too worried about it, depending on what I'm doing, because if it's on that street and it's a little tiny street, it's good enough. But if I'm mapping something on a big long road, I need to make sure the numbers are going in the right direction. The city directory helps me with this. It tells me every street and it tells me the numbers and where it runs from and to. So I can take my existing 911 roads and I can flip them and do what I need to do to make them so that they will work with the data that I'm pulling from the city directories. In addition, just as an FYI, it lists every single person that lives in the city. And again, every single person, I'm going to put that in quotes because as we have learned, or we will learn, that is not entirely true, but it's somewhat true. And it lists here, basically where they worked and where they lived and what their occupation was. And then it lists every single street and who lived on every single street and the order that they lived in. So you can use that as a check on some things. So here's my city directory points that I pulled as part of that we called it Dirty History Project, following in Ed Hawes' footsteps. And so these are one of my data sets that I have for city directory points. That a lot of this comes from city directories. And so these are all the potential toxic pollution sources for Portland. Because they're in a database, I have the name of the business, the type of business that it is, the address, the source, the location, and then any notes that I might have taken along the way, which can help you locate and also figure out what's going on at that business. From there, you can create things like heat maps. You can do time series with those points to see where things were put and when. you can pull out specific things. So like in this case, I pulled out dry cleaners because we know that dry cleaners were a big source of pollution, particularly um, in the early part of the 20th century. And this is a time, again, a time series. So that becomes, the time frame of it, because of the chemicals that are used, becomes important. And you can see that there's a bit of a pattern here. They fall right in the downtown area and along some of the major routes, particularly Congress Street. Might be a couple reasons for that. A lot of people traveled those routes, probably one reason, but that route was also one of the first ones to have city sewers. And of course, back then, the solution to pollution was dilution, and they used to dump things down the sewer. So um, the next source that I use and types of projects that I've worked on have to do with, some of you may have seen these Sanborn fire insurance maps. Once again, I'm going to show my geekness. When I was in my early 20s, when I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, one of the things that I did is I worked for a gentleman in the evenings cleaning office buildings. And one of the offices that we cleaned was what was it? Insurance Services of Maine. And they provided insurance ratings for various businesses. And they had an entire room full of fire insurance maps. We used to take our lunches there. So when we would have our dinner in the evening after we were cleaned a couple buildings, and we'd go there, have our dinner, and then we'd clean there. While everybody was eating lunch, I was looking at the fire insurance maps. I became totally obsessed with them. And for those who don't know, they used to send them to the various cities and various places, and they would send out the maps, and then they would put stickers on them. They would send you a sticker that you would put over a certain area to show that things had changed. So they would update them annually. In the front of the book, it has a list of all the updates. They're really, really cool. If you haven't seen one, you should. I know they have some at the Osher Map Library. They're really worth going and taking a look at. And the legends and the information on them very complex. You can tell if they're brick buildings or the types of buildings that they are. There's information written on them, as you will see, about let's see here. You can see that, they have hay and straw in this building. This was most likely a stable of some sort. There's a shed, there's coopers. So it gives you information on what was going on in the building, as well as how many stories. So this tells you that it's 3 stories. These numbers are the numbers along the street. So you know the actual number of the building, so you can get information from that. So there's a wealth of information here, in terms of what, and also the pipes, the various sewer pipes. These were started sometime around 1866, which is when Portland had its major urban fire. That was at the time, it was until Chicago, it was the largest urban fire of its time. And I have heard that that fire is a lot of why Sanborn got its start doing what it's doing, is because of the major losses during that fire. So georeferencing, I start out with that, and again, turn them black and white because that's an easier georeferencing and easier to work with. And start referencing buildings. I have some methods for creating buildings automatically from the lines. It works okay, but a lot of it you end up having to go by hand. But once you've created those buildings, there's lots of really cool things you can do with it. For instance, in addition to whether they're brick or wood or whatever they are, you can also color them by use, because all those use codes are coded into the buildings. And so in this case, I have taken those buildings and I've color coded them based on use. And then I can also take the information from the fire insurance maps. I can lay those on top of that, and I can figure out what's going on in those buildings. So I can get information from the maps, as well as I can pull information from the Sanborns and then supplement the information I already have with the Sanborns, or verify the information. And then this is really cool. You can, come on, page down. I don't know, I'm doing it, but it's not working. Come on. There we go. And because we have height information on that, we can actually visualize these things in 3D, which is pretty cool. Particularly, I've done huge parts of the city, and you can see changes over time, which is a really interesting and cool way to look at things. And then in this case, these fire insurance maps were from what did I say, 1886. So this is the fire 20 years before. And so you can see that all of these buildings were new. And I don't have them shown by the type of construction, but I'd be willing to bet that almost all of these are the ones that are brick constructed, because they constructed most of the buildings after the fire were constructed in brick. Over here, these are mostly residential, probably not brick, but a lot of the ones in this part of the city were brick after the fire. All right, and then I think a lot of you have probably seen this image somewhere around it's about 20 years old. I think it's actually 20 years old this year or last year. This is something that I created in working with the folks at the Osher Map Library back in, like I said, 2004, I think it was. They were doing an exhibit. It was called Creating Portland, 2 Centuries of Maps and Views. And it was curated by Earl Shuttleworth, who at the time I think was the executive director of the Maine Historic Preservation. He is an amazing historian, particularly in Portland. He's from Portland. And he curated this amazing exhibit of all kinds of maps of Portland. I was asked to come in and to, quote, summarize the exhibit on one wall for the exhibit. No pressure there. What do you do? I thought about a lot of different things. I had just seen the work that was done in Boston, where they had done something similar to this, where for Back Bay, and shown where the area was filled. And so I decided to try to do the same thing for Portland. It's not as easy as it looks, and you folks are the first ones to hear it here. This is a secret that I have not disclosed. It's not a huge secret, but that I haven't disclosed is I looked at this, and the coastline is all different. Downtown Portland here, the area shown in red, has burned about 4 times. 3 or 4 times since this map was done in 1776. So none of the roads are the same. The only thing that's the same that I can see is Congress Street, that runs from the town center over towards the west. And that's not enough to do a decent georeference for. So what do? Well, I worked backwards. This is the big secret. I started with the 1912 coastal chart, because that chart has a lot of the same landforms, a lot of the same roads. Everything is pretty much the same as it is today. So I was able to georeference this one without a lot of difficulty. And they had asked me to do a time series anyway, so I just worked it backwards. From there, I did the 1866 coastal chart, which I love this particular chart. It was engraved, I believe it was engraved by Alex Longfellow, who was, I think, if I remember right, I'm not good at these details. I think he was the nephew of Henry Wadsworth. So it was pretty special to find this map. And I found it online on the NOAA site. And it has some amazing detail when you scan it in at high resolution, and it's just absolutely beautiful. The engraving on this is just pretty amazing, and it has a lot of information. I was able to pull at one point. I was able to pull all of the backwards here, all of the buildings out of this. Using the technology, was able to pull the buildings and basically put building footprints for 1866 onto a map, which was pretty cool. This is an 1854 city directory map. It provided that interim space in between the 1776 and the 1866. Not the greatest map in terms of accuracy of locational accuracy, but it worked. And you'll also see, if you look closely in the downtown area, you'll see an outline on that. That outline was somebody's interpretation of the 1866 fire and where it burned. And then we were able to do the 1776 map. Another part of this that we did as part of this was I was able to take each of those maps and trace the shape. So you're able to see the shape through time. And Portland is about 38% fill, just the peninsula area, that we were able to determine from those various charts and maps. The other piece that we did, which is not as sort of well known, but was also pretty interesting, is to look at what we called the urban area, the area that was built up, and pulled those areas from the maps, and that shows you through time, with the darkest area being the oldest area and onto the lightest areas. So we were able to pull that information out as well. A couple of reasons, a couple of just interesting things that we discovered with this and knew. If you don't know this already, if you're not familiar with Portland, Portland is actually shaped, topographically, it's shaped like a saddle. And so the east end at the top and the west end down at the, west end at the bottom, are both on hills. And so there's a, if you actually, so this area here is a hill, and this area here is a hill. So the land slopes down towards the center and slopes down away in all directions. So trying to put the railroad in Portland in the, in the early 1900s when they started building railroads, that was a bit of a problem. And so that is why they started building out around, or one of the reasons they started building out around. And if you look at by 1917, you'll see that most of that had been accomplished. And even the areas up here where I'm not showing any land, there were that railroad sits on a little spit of land that they constructed for it to sit on. So even those are on spits of land. Another interesting thing about this is when I first saw this, and after having seen this, you probably are all going to shake your heads and say, well, of course. But when the state of Maine came out with this, and I think they came out with this first sometime in the, I don't know, mid to late 2000s, I think it was, which was the coastal inundation maps where they showed storm surge. And the first time I saw this, I remember looking at this thinking, that shape looks familiar. And lo and behold, if you add the 1776 shape of Portland to that inundation map, it matches almost perfectly. So should we experience that kind of storm surge, Portland will, anything that was constructed since 1776, all of the fill that happened in Portland would essentially be underwater. Okay, so city directory. Here's another project that I worked on. This was part of what was intended to be my thesis for American and New England Studies. I unfortunately had the program was eliminated, and while it was eliminated, I was unable to finish for personal reasons. So I never did finish my thesis, but this is essentially my thesis presentation, or part of it. So these are points that I pulled from the 1850 city directory. Now, the 1850 city directory, interestingly, has, in 1850, Portland had about 18,000 residents. The Portland city directory shows about 15,000, 1,500. So quite a sizable difference from that early city directory and the number of people that they listed and the actual census that was done. But there's still some interesting patterns here. The city directories early on were done as a money-making venture. I mean, they were a money-making venture all through their history, but early on they were created and they got their money from advertising. And so if you advertised, you got a space in the directory. And then they said it was a complete, I think they said true and accurate counting of all people in the city. Clearly that wasn't the case, but there were some issues with that, but it's still useful in some ways if taken for what it is. So this is everybody who lived in the city, according to the city directory, as well as the businesses. Now the businesses are in blue, and the places that people lived are in the orange color. Some people lived and worked in the same location. Those are in the green. So that gives you sort of the distribution. You can see that almost all of the businesses were in the city core, and people lived not only in the core, but they were spreading out onto the two ends of the city. Once again, like the other data, I'm showing you here just a piece of that where it shows, this person was a clerk at 482 Congress Street, and they resided in Falmouth. And then there's some code in here. This James Josephine Gardner, 428 Summer Street, in South Portland. South Portland, I'm not sure if that was, I think that's where the Gardner in South Portland, and resided 775 Highland Avenue. So that's information that you can take. I put all of that into a database, and yes, I hand typed it in 1,500 lines. That's not a lot. It would be really difficult to do, but the newer city directories, you can find a lot of them that have been transcribed using optical character recognition, and so you can pull down the entire city directory as a database, which is pretty cool. And it gives you all the info on what they did and addresses, etc., into a database. So here's something, this was part of a little bit of what I was doing for the work that I was doing, the research. This shows you where all the boarding houses and hotels were. So you can pull information like that. This is our goods and services. So these are basically retail businesses and places that are selling goods and services to people who worked and lived in the city. And you can see they're almost all centered along the streets around the waterfront and back from the waterfront up to Middle Street. And again, the residences. So these are people, in this case, these orange dots are people who worked in those industries. And then you get into shipping, and you can see that shipping, the shipping tends to be a lot closer to the waterfront. And again, just to back up a little bit, this waterfront that I'm showing you, seeing in gray, this is today's waterfront, but I'm actually showing you the 1850 waterfront before. So the brown wharves are, and the darker outline of Portland is what Portland looked like at the time I'm doing this. And so these are people engaged in the shipping trades. These are people engaged in shipbuilding. So as you can see, in 1850, a lot of the people who lived in the city were engaged in shipbuilding. That was a major part of what was going on. And I have statistics somewhere that was part of all of this, but the number of ships that were built was pretty substantial back in the 1850s. Then we get into the 1850 census, pulling out detailed census information. I found some lots and lots of pages, lots and lots of math, lots and lots of spreadsheets, but was able to pull out a lot of information. So here for the census, there were about I think it was like 18,077 people, something like that, but about 18,000 people lived in Portland according to the census. A vast majority of them lived on the East End and the West End in Portland, the two hills, which was and probably still is, probably from the peninsula, the most residential areas. If you add the number of people, this is where it starts to get interesting about the city directories. So the population, like I said, was 18,000. There are only 1,525 workers listed. Now, some of that are, it doesn't include the kids, it doesn't include in the city directory. So the number isn't going to match, but it is kind of interesting that there's a fairly substantial difference there. Also, interestingly, there are in Ward 1, there's about 25% of the population lives in Ward 1 according to the census. According to the directory, only about 15% of the population live in Ward 1. So there's some fairly substantial differences in the distribution of where they collected people. And we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that just a little bit in a minute. This is the shipping industry from the 1850s. So these are the census data are the people engaged in shipping. So you can see that there are out of 950 people that worked in shipping according to the census. About a third, 34%, lived up on the East End. According to the city directory, only 15% of the people engaged in shipping lived in the West End. Right. Then we get into the goods and services. So with goods and services, that number, and I didn't do the math on this, but I sort of ran out of time. I was working on that this morning, trying to pull out these numbers again, find them. But goods and services, you'll see that this is a little, again, the same kind of, not as many people live here and not as many dots. So I think that the distribution is a little closer to what it actually is. And you also have to keep in mind, and I didn't talk about this, but oftentimes one dot on this map represents many people. And I do have some maps that show that, but often there were boarding houses where a lot of people lived, or there were multiple generations, multiple people living in a house. And so they would all be at the same address. So if you're looking at numbers, it doesn't quite show from the map because there are multiple dots stacked one on top of the other in this particular map. I have other maps that don't show that as much. Then we get into some of the census statistics, like these were Irish-born people. Portland had a lot of Irish folks that lived in the city, and a lot of them lived in this area, which I think was called Little Ireland or something like that. So there were a lot of folks that lived, but also lived up on the hill. And it's pretty much well known that a lot of the folks that lived up here on the east end of Portland were very much working class, blue collar, or folks that worked in these industries. One of the things that I sort of suggest in some of the work that I've done is, if you think about down here along the waterfront, there's a lot of shipbuilding going on. Shipbuilding is a dirty, nasty, smelly, shipbuilding and fishing and all of the industries that go along with it are very dirty and nasty. And what do we have in Maine? We have prevailing westerly winds. And so on a nice, warm, sunny summer afternoon, you're going to get wind that's going to blow right up onto the West End. People that didn't have a lot of money are the people who lived on the West End. Yes, there were great views, but those people were congregated down further this way. There weren't people living at that time out that took out that vista across Casco Bay. It was mainly just the working class that lived further down the hill, where you could smell all those horrible smells and see those the things that were going on, the noises and all of that sort of thing. And then this is another really interesting statistic here, is the what they called free colored in 1850. Portland, if you're not aware, was a big part of the triangular trade, did a lot of shipping to the West Indies. Brown's Sugar House, which was located right around here. The Great Fire started in 1866, started at Brown's Sugar House and spread across the city up through this way. And so Portland was a big part of the triangular trade and had a lot of folks that were here. I mapped also people who came from Africa and different countries, and that was a big part. You don't hear a lot about that. That's a statistic that has pretty much been lost. So that pretty much is a little bit of everything in terms of the types of things that I'm doing. I'm working on a couple of other, I'm going to back up for just 1 minute. I'm working on a couple other projects right now. One is the LiDAR that I talked about for the Wyndham area, and a couple other little areas that I'm interested in. If the one for Wyndham works out, there's a few other areas that I'm going to work on as well. Things that I've been interested over the years. And then the other thing that I'm working on in conjunction with the Osher Map Library, they provided me with a number of maps. And so the Creating Portland, the 1776 outline and that overlay, we're going to be doing an update on that. And hopefully that's going to be, we'll be working on that. It's pretty much finished. And that one takes the entire map. It takes us out to the islands and around the Back Cove and into Falmouth and all of that. So that it gives you a little better idea of what was going on. It's not just focused in this area. So if you keep in mind, back in 2002 or 2003 when I was doing that. A high resolution scan of that area was next to impossible. And now OSHA has all of those things at high resolution. And back when I was doing that, trying to do just this one area scanned at high resolution and trying to georeference it and try to make that work on the computers that we had. And that was a really difficult thing. Computers are more powerful now. The scanning is much, much better, much higher resolution. Almost everything I did before was just with my little desktop scanner. And now I can do some really amazing things. So keep an eye out for the new updated Creating Portland series of maps that we're going to be coming out with. And then I guess the last thing I just really quickly wanted to talk about, and then I'm happy to, if anybody has any questions, happy to answer them. These are some of my, there are lots and lots of data sources, but these are some of my favorites. I'm going to just jump over here to, let's see, right here. So let's start at the map library. So the map library, you'll see there's, here's one of the earliest recreation maps. Portland, love this map. But they have an enormous, I'll just click on this one just to give you an idea if you haven't seen what they do. The scanning resolution, all of these maps are available for you to work with and to download. And they have just a great collection, and clearly it's not going to come up very quickly. I've got too much open on my computer. Digital Main Repository is another place that has great collections. So they have a lot of digital maps as well. So that's another place that I go to a lot. Library of Congress is another one of my favorites. A number of the maps that I used in the Creating Portland series were done through the Library of Congress, and I've done a lot of work since then. They have a lot of really good maps, great collection of bird's eye views, and everything is available for download at high resolution. David Rumsey, this is another one that I really like. So Osher Map Library and David Rumsey, I think of them very similarly in terms of they both started by a gentleman. They're very similar and very different. They were both started by gentlemen who were really interested in maps and collected maps. David Rumsey has put a lot of time and effort into creating a digital collection and not bricks and mortar. Osher Map Library has just this wonderful teaching and place where you can come and look at maps and see, touch, and feel them and work with them. So two very different things, but both excellent collections. This map search is really cool. So you can come in here and I can do a search. I can find a place. So I'm going to search for Gray, Maine, which is where I live. And it will zoom into Gray. Oh, yeah, that wasn't Gray, Maine. I'm not quite sure what that is.
I'm pretty sure that's in France.
Yeah. Let me see. US. Just do Maine. Good enough. But I can zoom in here and I can look for a specific place, and it will give me a list of recommended maps for that specific area. So that's a pretty cool way to find what you're looking for. So here are some of these Cumberland County atlases that I've worked with. Some of those I've pulled from David Rumsey and some other collections, but you can see some really cool things that way and explore, and you can do some georeferencing on his site, that sort of thing. This one is fairly new. I think Esri has a hand in this. And I'm going to just show you a couple interesting things you can do with this. I live on Hyde Road in Gray, along this road. And I want you to keep an eye on this particular area that I've got here. If I go back and I look at, I can come in here and look at different scales. I'm going to adjust this to look at just the 64K maps right now. And if I turn on this one from the 1800s, you'll see that the road that I live on went all the way through from Route 100 to 02 to Route 115 up here in in another part of gray. It doesn't do that anymore. But that is something that it did at one point, I know from some of my research. Then if I go and I look at the 1940s, it's not there. And High Road isn't even there, right? That road goes away completely. If I go to the 1950s, I'm not sure that one actually, yeah, it's not there in the 1950s, right? So it has totally gone away. And then if you go back down to, I think you have to go to about 1986.
Would that be a function of the size of the road, potentially,
No,
Rosemary? Because
no,
it
it's
looks
not.
like the major routes are the ones that are just being maintained.
No, this is a little hard to see. I'm just doing it really quickly, but no, it's not. This road was actually abandoned by the town. It used to go all the way through. You can still walk from here to here. There's still a path that goes through here, but that has totally been abandoned. And this road, I was the first house built on this road, and it was built in 1975. I'm told there used to be a house of ill repute at the end of this road. I haven't found anything definitely on that, but so the road was actually abandoned by the town and was resurrected in the 1970s at some point. So the maps do actually accurately, I don't know, they don't totally accurately reflect it, because they were resurrected in the 1970s, and some of the 1970s, it's one of the reasons I didn't want to pick the wrong ones. If you come back here and you look at some of the ones from 1970s, the map was there. The road was back there, but it doesn't show. But that's a function of time, and topo maps, we all know how often were they updated, that sort of thing. A lot of it's a function of that, but it's kind of an interesting thing that you can see, and it's not entirely a function of some of it is, but it's not entirely a function. This little road here isn't there, but there's some other really small roads that do show up here that are not, this is an example, really small road. I think it's a dirt road, and it shows up here. But that one had gone away. It went away for a period of time. I have about 15, 10, 12 minutes, whatever it is, left. I can talk forever, as most of you who know me know that. But I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments or anything that they want me to answer, or want me to
Yeah,
go
so if you
away.
have questions, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them live here as much as we can. So we have some calls about fascinating work and the impact of the scale of the map. So I don't really foresee them as actually being questions, but more comments. So one of the things that makes me, I got my start in GIS too, and working with historical boundary changing and those sorts of things. So these things always interest me in terms of what's happening. And one of the things that it makes me think about is the main office of GIS and the Geo Library. Because a lot of times what we do with the Geo Library is we try to get a bunch of resources together that are current. Would you perceive that there would be a value to the Geo Library trying to have the historical artifacts that all of the towns have and have those accessible in a similar way?
That's actually something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because as we've moved, so much of what I'm showing you here is all done from analog data sources, right? So much of what I'm doing is, here's this, for those who can see it, here's that city directory. It's huge. It's a huge amount of data here. Those things don't exist anymore. Those city directories don't exist anymore. I have a whole collection of data. I've been saving data from the main office of GIS for years, on CDs. So, just every so often, as I'm using it, I just archive it and save it. But yes, I think that there's a lot of information and data that would be useful to researchers, maybe not now, but 20 years from now, 100 years from now, I'm not sure where researchers are going to find the data, the digital data, the way that we find analog. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is.
See, we have a question in the chat about the LiDAR data that has been available in the base contour interval used here in the presentation, 6-inch, 1 foot, 2 foot, something else. So any clarity on that?
So for LiDAR data, I'm still, when it comes to, I'm assuming you're talking about creating LiDAR data. And I'm still playing around with that. I've downloaded some LiDAR points and played around with different resolutions to try to figure out what the best resolution is to get what I'm looking for, to be able to get the best representation of the landscape. Because of the point cloud and how, if you're going up and doing your own point cloud, that's one thing, but we're doing it from the data that's publicly available. So if I go too small with my resolution, I'm not accomplishing anything. And if I go too big, then I might be missing something. So I've been playing around a lot to try to figure out what the best resolution for what my intention is to see things on the ground and what I'm hoping to see on the ground. I have one person who has asked me to create some LiDAR to be able to find, okay, I am such a geek, a glacial erratic in northern Maine. There's a gentleman that I know who used to be a librarian at the University of Southern Maine, and he has some documentation of what this person called the largest glacial erratic they'd ever seen in Maine, and it was massive. And he's been trying to find it based on the information in the text, and he hasn't been able to find it. And I've been trying to find it with LiDAR. But again, finding the right resolution and finding the best way to do it is it's taking a little bit of time, and it's not my full-time job. It might be someday when I retire again, but it isn't yet.
Yeah, we have a colleague up at the University of Maine at Presque Isle who might actually have some eyes as to where that might be on the ground because
Ah,
he's a geologist, right? So
yes.
he goes out and does a lot of field work. So he may actually know where that is
I know
if
approximately where it is.
yeah.
I mean, I have a written description of where it is, and we can pinpoint it, but we just can't find it on the. He's been all over that area. He can't find it on the ground, so we'll have to talk offline about that.
Yeah. So I see something in the chat about is this being recorded? Yes, Steve started recording this when we started. It will be made available on our website. So there's another question. How do you pick your projects? Do you have a specific question in mind, or do you start with the historical maps and see the types of questions that come up?
Oh, a little bit of all of the above. I have things that I'm particularly interested. Gambo Falls, the gunpowder mills have always fascinated me. Portland to Lewiston interurban railroad is another thing that's fascinated me. If am I still sharing my screen? I am.
Yeah.
So if you can see here, let me get my cursor. Whoop. Gotta go back. Oh, wait a minute. I gotta remember what I'm doing here. Bear with me. Right there. So this area, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you'll see where the main turnpike goes down here. And then, so the Portland to Lewiston interurban, on the screen, it's about an inch or so, maybe not even that, to the right of the main turnpike. The Portland to Lewiston interurban ran from Portland all up through Gray. It's a hiking trail now, and it's really close to my house. And that's something I've been really interested in. I just haven't gotten around to doing it. So sometimes it's just based on what I'm interested in. And then there are things I sometimes see on maps like those Sanborn maps. It's like, what can I do with those? They are just so cool. What can I do? How can I create a project from that? So it's a little bit of both. And then I've had folks, Wyndham Historical Society has come to me several times with things that they've been interested in, and I've worked with them on that. So there's sometimes there have been things where people just know what I do. I had a situation, actually, it's kind of cool. Downtown Portland, um, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Thames Street in downtown Portland, but it is basically commercial street extension. So when you go towards the east end, once you get to Franklin Arterial, that name changes to Thames Street. I had somebody who was a developer down there, and they contacted me because they were involved in all of that, and they didn't want to call it Commercial Street Extension. And they had me go through a series of maps to find out if there was an old name that they could use. And Thames Street was on one of the original maps from the 1700s, and that's how that got named. So there's lots of things that sort of spur my interest. There's a few folks at the Osher Map Library right now are trying to get me interested in a couple of projects, and that might happen. We'll see. I need to retire again so that I have more time.
Don't we all?
I've already retired once.
Yeah. So as a request for bibliography so we can look things up ourselves, and I'm sure that Rosemary has ways of doing that if that's desirable. I don't think anything you've mentioned, most of this is publicly available, so that would be
Almost all the data is publicly available, but it just takes a lot of work to assemble it.
yeah. So let's see. I've been looking for a resource for historical tax maps from 1970, 1990, general area. Do you have any recommendation about that?
Historical tax map 1970 to 90. Generally, the towns should have them. If you're looking for a specific town, the town should have those tax maps. Most of them do, and they will be down in their basement somewhere because they're not. But a lot of towns actually don't update them that often. And so you'll get a tax map from 1970, which will be used depending on the town and how much growth they have and what they do. They will just continue to do updates using my very first job was working for the Greater Portland Council of Governments. And part of the reason I was hired is because I could do hand cartography. And we had towns that still did tax map updates, and that was in 2000. So I would start with the towns. And if you have specific towns you're looking for, if you want to try to give me a call, I might be able to help you because I know I know where some of these things live. But generally, I would start with the town.
All right. Are you hoping to publish the Sanborn layers you created for your research on Portland?
I have no plans to publish anything. I do this mostly because I enjoy it. At some point I was planning to publish for my thesis. I don't know where that's going to go now because a lot of this was heading towards a thesis, but that program has gone away. So I'm not sure what I'm planning to do, but if anybody has any thoughts, or I'm happy to talk to anybody about any thoughts they might have on what we could do with this data, because I think it's really cool. I have just recently set up a ArcGIS online account, which my intention is to put a lot of this data up online.
We have another question. How long did it take to draft a hand-drawn map of Portland?
How long? I don't think I've ever done a hand-drawn map of Portland. But I've done a lot of hand-drawn maps, and hand-drawn maps take a long time, depending on what you're doing. But I've done a lot of maps for publication by hand using pen and ink, and it's 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 an art and a science, and it takes I think I'm trying to remember when I used to do them. When I did a lot of them for publications, I'm trying to think how many hours I used to think, but I think it was like 40 hours or something for a basic map is what I used to charge. I can't remember now, but something like that.
All right. We have Andy has put out a resource for folks about the Sanborn fire maps. We have a request for an email address to contact you. So
I can put that in the chat if you'd like.
I don't know if it's going to go to everybody because it looks like it says hosts and
Oh, okay.
panels. So
That's right. We can add it.
Send that out when we send out resources from the talk.
Absolutely.
Looks like all the questions that we have in the chat. And then there's one more in the Q&A. We can find this just in the historical topo. Kirsten, if you have anything to help clarify that, if you can throw that in the chat, that would be great. Because it looks like there's a context of a different conversation.
There we go. But I am happy to share any resources, anything I can help anybody with. I love this stuff, as you can probably tell.
Oh, okay. So just was curious if we could find the historical data from Portland that Rosemary was discussing. So I would assume so.
Yeah, everything that I've done is publicly available. If there's something that somebody is specifically interested in, because there's been a lot of data for Portland. If somebody's interested in something specific, we can put the contact information. Just be happy to just let me know and I'll be happy to share whatever I can. But the map, the sources that I provided at the end, and we'll be sharing that. But the sources that I provided at the end will be those are some of my primary sources. The Library of Congress has an amazing collection. I think they have a whole collection of Sanborns. NOAA coastal charts, an amazing collection there. These historical topos. There's so many sources out there. It's just a matter. And when I started this 20 years ago, there weren't nearly these sources that there are now. But there's just so much because everybody's making their collections digital.
All right, we have one more question here in the chat, and I'll kind of start taking this one. The question is, who's in the GIS user group? So the four people you see here in the panel are all officers of the user group. So to kind of field this question, I kind of want to address where we kind of all come from, and there's some other people who are here on the call who are also members of the user group. And the answer is realistically, anybody who has an interest professionally, enthusiast, whatever, of geospatial things. So I am an academic. I am a data science professor at UMA. So I have a basis in doing data query systems and those sorts of things. My training was in spatial and temporal data. So there's people like me that are in this group. Rosemary, if you want to throw out how you became part of the user group or just general basis.
I can just say that I've been a member of the user group for a long time. I like to tell people that my first user group meeting we probably could have had in a phone booth. There weren't very many people. I think there was about 20 people there. But I've been a member all the way through being, we encourage students to be members. We have student memberships and we have student scholarships, something that is really important. I was a member when I was in academia. I was a member when I was working for myself. I've worked in municipalities. I've basically done all of the various things, and I've continued my membership through all of that. And the membership is invaluable because there's so many different types of people: state employees, municipal employees, public employees, you name it. We have a little bit of everybody, and you don't have to live in Maine.
Yep. Speaking of state employees, Ashley, what do you do these days?
Planner for the Municipal Planning Assistance Program in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry at the state. I'm also currently a student at Johns Hopkins and hoping to graduate next month. So very excited. I've been a member for the last 3 or 4 years since I moved to Maine and figured out it was a thing. So happy to be here.
And Steve, I believe you're in municipal government?
Yes, yeah, I work for the town of Wyndham. My past is working for private enterprise, being a crime analyst. So there's lots of different, anything that really you can put on a map that you have an interest in. It's a good profession to get into.
We have members that are from the local industry in terms of the geospatial industry in Maine. There are all kinds of different companies that have footprints in Maine that put out their own systems and data products and all those sorts of things. So we have folks from Blue Marble, folks from Esri, all kinds of different areas there. If you see an organization on our sponsor list, it's probably a good idea or probably a good bet that there's some connection of the organization through some member to one of those lists of the sponsors. So we realistically come from everywhere, and some of the things that we try to do to gain membership and gain exposure and build a community are these Mappy Hour things that we're doing at UMA in conjunction with local conferences that get into industries that involve the GIS community. We hold some years we'll hold a spring thematic conference. We've held drone conferences in the past few years. Things about climate change conferences up in Orono. We hold an annual conference every October, November in either the Bangor area, the Portland area, or the Augusta area to kind of highlight where the lion's share of our members are. So we're really all over the place. So if you have people who make sense to be part of the organization, obviously send them our contact and ways to do that because we are the professional organization of GIS in the state. So it makes sense to do that. So Fred, I definitely appreciate that question. Anything else here before we close up for the afternoon? All right. So once again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend this afternoon. Lovely talk by Rosemary, and thank you, Rosemary, for your time and efforts in keeping the user group vibrant and also in doing historical mapping work for the general population, which is always an important thing to keep in context that space and time represent context of any data. As a data scientist, I'll say this. So space and time are two of the more important aspects of the data world. So the more that we can keep mapping context alive and the historical nature of that through time and progression makes all the sense in the world for contextualizing the world we live in. So thank you,
Well
everybody.
said.
And I will hopefully catch you at other events that we run. And if you have ideas for events, please feel free to hit us up at our board email. We would love to have presenters from outside of our board because there's a bigger community than we even represent. So please, if you have ideas, send them our way.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.